Dr. Mayer, thank you for being part of this article, which will be featured in our upcoming issue for Creighton Journal of Interdisciplinary Leadership, which is themed Preparing Leaders to Transform Complex Environments.
I'm very pleased to be here.
Yeah, we're really excited about this and to have this be our feature and headline article. So we'll start with our first question that we all formulated. What skills do you believe are required for leaders to successfully navigate conflict associated with organizational change?
It seems to me that the most important skill is for a leader to be comfortable with conflict. Because what I've seen with a lot of people in leadership positions, and I've struggled with myself when I've been in a leadership position, is that our instinct is that if there's a conflict, we need to get past it real quickly and resolve it real quickly. And yet we know that conflict is healthy for organizations, and that suppressed conflict makes the problem that organizations face worse. That a productive and almost welcoming approach to conflict leads to more creativity and more productivity. So in many ways, the skills that I think we need to start with as leaders are personal skills, working on our personal ability to handle conflict, to appreciate conflict, and to recognize a value in it. Now, that doesn't mean we also don't need to have the skills to handle it when it gets out of control or it gets destructive. We need that as well. But I think what goes along with that is a key challenge, which is to understand what is really important to people. I think we focus so much on how to fix things and how to suppress the unpleasant elements to it that we don't recognize underlying it a conflict, what people the place people are coming from that represents something really important and meaningful to them. I mean, obviously, the list of specific tactics could go way on, but I think it really starts from those things.
From being comfortable.
Being comfortable and appreciative of the importance and role of conflict, and being open to understanding what is really important to people beyond the superficial things that often become the stalking horse for conflict, the real issues.
Thanks, Bernie. My question's similar in nature. It relates to the concept of conflict competence. How would you describe conflict competence? What is it? How is it developed? And how does it contribute to the skills necessary to manage conflict?
So I think all of us have found a way of handling conflict in our lives. We wouldn't have made it to leadership positions, to adulthood, if we didn't. Doesn't mean we've become great at it or always constructive at it, but we have our own way of doing it. So in a way, building on what I said before, conflict competence really starts with understanding how we handle conflict and what works and what doesn't. Now, it seems to me that a conflict competent leader is someone who starts with that and then moves on to understanding how to help people say what's really important to them, how to help people listen to what other people are saying, especially when they disagree with it, how to recognize the cultural framework or the cultural milieu in which an organization functions. So in some organizations, it's really easy for people just to say what they want and to get on each other's case and to be very assertive. In other places, that is very oppressive and not okay. I think there's a couple other essential skills that go along with conflict competence. One is understanding power dynamics. And the nature of organizational life is that there's always power dynamics at play. There's usually hierarchies of power. And how that, so we can say, look, I have an open door, come in, you can talk to me, whatever you want. That may or may not be realistic depending on the nature of your power position in the organization and the nature of how power flows. The other thing that I think we really need to be very able to recognize is gender and ethnicity issues and culture issues more generally. In almost any workplace, probably in any social setting in our world, gender issues are often a sub-theme for a lot of what happens in conflict. And we really need to understand that, as well as cultural issues more generally. I think we need to understand something about negotiation. I think we have to have a good understanding of how to help people kind of bring together the need to address the interests of others they're in conflict with while advocating for their own interests as well. And that's essentially at the heart of good negotiation, which means knowing how to help people both be effectively competitive and constructively cooperative at the same time. So that's important. And in maybe a little bit more of a more general sense, I think leaders need to understand system dynamics, because how systems operate and how energy flows through systems and how systems seek to enforce the rules of the system are often what are at the heart of a lot of not so constructive conflicts that develop in organizations.
Great. I did have one follow-up question, just because one thing really struck out as important, and kind of when you talked about at the beginning, where people just have to know how they engage in conflict. And then you talk a little bit about the paradox of constructively competitive conflict engagement and cooperative engagement, and how understanding how to use that effectively or manage that paradox effectively is important. Where do you find, or how do you find that balancing those two extremes can really help a leader be successful?
Well, as you know, Brian, I just wrote this book called The Conflict Paradox, which talks about a range of these bifurcated ways in which we look at the world. One is, and particularly in conflict, and one of the ones I looked at is how we integrate, or how we handle where we think we have people in conflict who are being competitive, and we need to help them cooperate, stop being so competitive. And I think there's an unreality there, because the nature of the world we live in, and what makes for good organizations is a certain amount of competition. The question is, how do you compete in a cooperative way, and how do you cooperate around how you compete? And I don't actually like the use of word balance. In that book, I really avoided it.
Okay.
Because it applies, well, you take a teaspoon of cooperation, you add it to a teaspoon and a half of competition, you mix it together, and it all comes out right. It is really a matter of understanding that they're not different. That every time we're competing, we're cooperating in order to compete. And that cooperation, to be real, to be something other than a nice phrase word, we can talk about collaboration all we want, has to be able to incorporate the competitive needs of the circumstance. So I think on some level, any of us who've played sports, which is most of us, realize that, sports are competition. But it's not effective competition without incredible amounts of cooperation. So I guess that's a simple answer to that. We could actually talk much more about, in a more detailed way, about what that actually looks like in a managerial situation or a leadership situation. But here's one maybe little example of that. Over many years, there has been a belief that what you really need to do when you bring groups together, teams together, and you have an issue is to help them brainstorm. And the idea of brainstorming is you come up with as many different ideas as possible without critiquing them, because that's supposed to help maximize cooperative potential, or the creative potential, I mean. But in quite a few studies now have shown that actually doesn't work. You get a much more creative output if you as people come up with ideas, you let them be critiqued. You let people have at it. So if you say something and I say, Well, I don't think that would really work, Ryan, because of this. And I say, what about this? And you say, oh, come on, you don't see what... That actually creates a more creative, collaborative, productive atmosphere than if we just sort of do the cooperative thing and listen to everybody's ideas.
So creative discourse throughout. So.
I have creative discourse throughout.
Yeah.
So I'd like us to... You guys are all in leadership positions. What do you think conflict competence for a leader means?
Well, I just want to address, I think that you've tied that in very well with the conflict competence and, the working with that paradox. And I like how you said, well, it's not so much a balance. And that's what conflict competence to me kind of means, is just being mindful and aware of each situation and understanding, how am I in tune with what's going on here, and how am I going to interact in this space to really be most constructive or effective in that situation. And I think that's where the conflict competence plays a big role in as a leader, is scanning, being aware, and mindful of how we are within that situation and how we influence those dynamics within the situation.
And perhaps to add to that, I think communication is very important as well. I think we as leaders need to be very cognizant of what we're listening to, that other people are saying or asking for, what their positions are, what their concerns are, and where they're coming from as it pertains to a particular issue.
Yeah, and I would certainly say understanding presence and truly active listening and truly listening to what's being said in that moment, and being comfortable to engage in conflict in some sort of strategy that you feel is effective or best suited, but also being open to being able to adapt as well.
Adaptability.
Just to build on the communication stuff you guys are talking about, one of the things that I have always thought was essential being an effective mediator is that it's very hard to teach, but you can work on it, is being able to track things at multiple different levels at the same time. And I think that's true for a leader too. So you bring your group together. You want to kind of put forth a vision for a direction a team might go or an organization might go. And what you need to do when you do that is to attend to what you have to say, how you're saying it, how it's coming across, what people are communicating back to you non-verbally or sometimes verbally, what your hope for the discussion you want to have in the room is, how you might facilitate that discussion at the same time, and you're doing this all while you're presenting something to the group. Now, I think the best leaders are the ones who can handle those multiple different tasks at the same time and can handle the multi-directionality, if you want to think of it that way, of communication. So as I'm talking, you're communicating, and I'm picking up and adjusting how I'm talking. As I'm listening and you're talking, I'm communicating to you something that will encourage you to communicate to me in a certain kind of way. And, that's not such an easy thing. It's easy to, it's not that hard to describe, but it's not that easy to do. And for me, when I am the best as a leader, as a teacher, as a mediator, as a husband, a parent, is when I am able to do both of those things. And where I think some of that comes from is the presence you were talking about. You have to really be present and centered and not have your mind going off in 100 different places, which sometimes we're good at and sometimes we're not so good at.
Another question for you, in reference to your book, Staying with Conflict. You indicate that due to varying degrees of complexity, not all conflicts are equal. You go on to describe some conflicts as enduring. How does an enduring conflict differ from other forms of conflict?
So, let me answer your question and then ask it in a slightly different way. The thing about an enduring conflict is that by the nature of that conflict, there's no agreement that we could come to that's going to end it. So an example would be our fundamental different views in this country about immigration. That's been with us since before the Constitution. It's an old issue. it represents some very fundamental different values. We can come up with agreements about specific aspects of the immigration issue. No matter what we agree to, the different value bases, the different narratives, the different identities, the next time there's a big immigrant group, when there's an economic downturn, it's still going to be an issue again. And so that's so to me, what an enduring conflict is a conflict that by its very nature is something we can do something about, but we can't fix it by resolving it. Now, the way I ask the question slightly different is, I think all conflicts have that component. Not all, but very many conflicts have that component in it. So a grievance at a workplace about who gets a preferred vacation time. You know, you could agree, you could reach a resolution on that grievance and about what to do about the vacation time. But there's often an element that represents, am I treated with respect? Are decisions made around here in a fair way? And do I have voice? Am I heard? Or on the other side, are employees always, feeling entitled and never really taking any ownership for the real problems the organization has? That kind of issue, that kind of element of a conflict is, you can pick almost anyone, is usually there. So I think of the enduring conflict as an aspect of conflict or a face of conflict, and most conflicts have multiple faces.
So what would you suggest to a leader as far as any specific approaches to take when confronting or having to address a conflict that might be described as enduring?
Right. I think one question we almost always have to face is, do we actually go for the enduring element? Or do we just figure out what we can fix and solve and for now move on? And I think sometimes that is what we do. I think sometimes you have to just solve that grievance about Christmas, or you just have to figure out what to do about a particular hiring that there is a real disagreement about, or an allocation of money that represents different priorities for an organization. But a leader also has to ask, when and how can I attach the deeper issues so that we can keep talking about it, so we can recognize them. So if we want to take a step back, if we want to talk about immigration in our society, which we certainly are doing right now, and not in a very productive way, in my opinion, but nonetheless we're doing it. When do we just talk about what we can do to modify a policy about immigration? How we're going to handle an influx of refugees, what we're going to do about whatever the issue is, and how, and at what point do we say, no, in order to get past this, we need to go a little deeper. We need to talk about what really are our values here, and what is our identity as, in this case, as Americans, or Canadians, or Australians, or wherever. And there's no place that becomes more profound, I think, than when you're dealing with issues of race, gender, and culture. So a leader has to decide, what is it we really need to talk about those things, and then how do we frame it? And even if we're not going to talk about it, how can we frame the immediate issue in our organization so at least it recognizes there's an ongoing element? It doesn't pretend it's all about what to do about this grievance or this case. It's not all about this instance or policy of sexual assault on campus or sexual harassment. You can come up with a policy, but you better also look at the underlying dynamics that create that throughout our society. There's another thing I think a leader can do, which is to think not just about an individual communication, a specific communication, how you and I talk, how I help the two of you talk, but systems and structures of communication. And so I think a good leader has to, that's part of what I was referring to earlier as systemic thinking. We have to think about what are the structures or systems of communication that allow us to deal with the difficult issues. And I think any of us in a leadership position can ask, what systems are there to deal with the harder issues that come out? Now, I'm not trying to say every time we should be spending all our time dealing with the harder issues. You cannot run an organization by always dwelling on that. But you have to talk about it sometimes. And a leader, in conjunction with the people and in a collaborative spirit with the people in the organization, needs to ask the question, how, what's the structure, how do I frame it, when, and when not.
So it sounds like it's important for leaders to understand that successful strategies to engage conflict doesn't mean a one and done kind of situation. It could be an ongoing process of dialogue in order to actually seek to understand what's going on and come up with creative strategies to solve it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And sometimes not coming up with creative strategies, just coming up with, we have to keep talking. The best strategy we have is to keep talking. It's like a lot of what you have to do in marriage sometimes.
So with your last response, you talked a lot about the complexities of the world and society that we currently live in. So it's actually a nice lead way into our next question of, as the world becomes more interconnected and complex, how can a leader bring various stakeholders into a shared understanding when disagreement exists?
Let me tell you what I'm thinking about your question. Is this really different than it's always been, even though we're more connected? We have more means of connecting. There's all sorts of technologies for connecting. But, when Franklin Roosevelt had to create a coalition to carry on World War II, he had to bring Joe Stalin and Winston Churchill and among others, and de Gaulle. These were all difficult people. At least their conversations were difficult. And yet, he brought them together. So what did he have to do to bring them together? Well, he had to keep his eye on the prize. What was this really all about? And what was a mutual prize they all had? And to recognize their suspicions and their concerns and their differences with each other, and not to try to ask them to give those up, but to stay instead together for a larger purpose. And he was very effective at that. And so I think what a leader, in some ways it gets back to what we were saying. If you want to look at what leaders in the world today to deal with really difficult issues like global climate change, or like what are we going to do about the mess in the Middle East, or about nuclear proliferation. Look at what happened with the treaty with Iran. And whatever you think about that, what had to happen for that treaty to get executed was that there had to be a broad understanding of two things. What was the essential goal? And two, what were the fundamental concerns of different sides, and not try to soft sell them, but to really recognize them. So, in a way it gets back to the first question you asked. We had to be aware of our own tendency to want to come up with superficial agreements when they're not a good idea. And we really have to go deeper. Our own tendency to want to avoid conflict. And we have to really listen and give credence to the very deep interests the other sides have. Now, I think something else is important that I'm not quite sure how it goes through everything we've talked about, which is a good leader also has to be authentic. They have to be themselves. How I could be a decent leader and how you could be a decent leader are probably very different because we're different people. We have different means of communicating, and stories we like to tell, and senses of humor, and whatever. So through it all, I think a leader has to find a way of doing this and being authentic and themselves and being aware of their own. We're all going to screw up sometimes trying to be good leaders. And a good leader is one who's not afraid to confront that. I think I've gone quite far away from your global issues, but we can get back there if you'd like.
So, as leaders engage in complex conflict or disagreements, in your books you talk about a few concepts, one being provocability, and then some of those conflict paradoxes. Is it important to have understanding of those, or do they add to the ability to bring stakeholders at least to the table for the?
Well, I think they do. That's why I wrote the books. Let me say something about provocability. That actually comes from a book called The Evolution of Cooperation by Robert Axelrod, where he did a whole series of experiments using the prisoner's dilemma about how cooperation and competition interact with each other. And he had several principles that were essential for handling conflict. One was what he called niceness, which is that we always start out with a cooperative opening. We start out with a willingness to be cooperative and to reciprocate cooperative gestures. But he always also talks about provocability, which means, you know, we have to be willing to not just be nice in the face of people taking advantage of us or being hostile to us or engaging in unacceptable behaviors. And the challenge is then, how do we respond to that? How do we be provocable? But do it in a way that opens the door to future cooperation, not overreact. Because I think a lot of us tend to cooperate and go the extra mile and cooperate and listen and try to take somebody else's point of view in, and after a certain point when we feel done to, then we're ready to go kablooey. We're ready to really just drop the nuclear bomb on somebody. And you can just hear this in how people are talking in our presidential campaigns right now. And that, it's important to know how to be effectively provocable, but to do it within an overall understanding of where you're trying to get. So I think it's extremely important if leaders don't know the specific concept of provocability, if they get that. If they get, all right, so we're just now beginning to enlighten our sanctions against Cuba after 50 years. It took 50 years of maybe for us to realize that the particular approach to provocability wasn't working very well. It wasn't getting us anywhere, it wasn't getting the Cubans anywhere. It was playing right into the Castro's hands in many ways. So, I think a leader has to be able to figure out, all right, sometimes I have to lay down the law, if you want to think about it that way. But how do I do it in a way that encourages people to get past that? And I think those of us who are teachers see that too. Sometimes we have to say to students, you folks aren't doing your assignments, or there are consequences for you not doing whatever. But to do it in a way that doesn't then shut down everybody and put us in the authority figure role again. So I think that kind of thing is, if you don't adhere to the term itself, you still have to understand how to do that. And in terms of some of the other things in the concepts in the conflict paradox, again, there's a lot of different ways of getting at the same issue. But I think what the conflict paradox basic message is if you want to be a more productive player in conflict, you have to be more, your thinking has to be a little more complex than just simply they're good guys and they're bad guys, there's us and there's them, there's cooperation, there's competition. You have to figure out a way of saying, how do I actually take both of these forces and bring them together? So if I may, can I just take a diversion for a moment into this election right now, since I seem to be going there? So one of the concepts in the book is on optimism and realism. And the way I think this plays out often is that let's assume we're a leader of an organization that's facing a financial crisis. And we want to work with a team about that. Now, the message we want to give is something other than, it's all going to be all right, I promise you. Right? But it also is something other than, oh, woe is me, we're hopeless, we're going under. This is hopeless. We want to find a way of giving a message that is realism laced with optimism, optimism laced with realism. If we don't, if optimism without realism is not genuine, it doesn't come across as real optimism. And realism without optimism is not really realistic too, because there is, in most circumstances, a cause to think, well, if we do something, we can make things better. Otherwise, why are we even trying? So, my introduction to this was going to be about the presidential campaign. Well, relax, it's not about the Republicans, this is about the Democrats now. Because there's so much more press that's been given to the Republican campaign. I think if you listen to the rhetoric of Hillary Clinton, she speaks the language of realism. And there are a lot of people are saying it's not enough. If you're so realistic, it seems calculated to us, or whatever. And if you listen to the language of Bernie Sanders, he speaks the language of optimism. And people are saying, give me a break. You can say all these things, but it doesn't make sense that it's going to happen. How's it going to happen? What are people saying? They're saying they want both. And the effective candidate and the effective politicians in our history, effective leaders in our history, are the ones who are really able to speak an integration of that. You can listen to Lincoln's rhetoric during the Civil War, or FDR, for example. I think our most effective leaders have always been able to find a way of bringing those things together. And so I think those concepts, and there's other things we can talk about that I talked about too, but those are two that I think are particularly important for leaders to get their hands on.
Do you see any connections between those concepts and some of those examples that you gave to understanding sources of power or authority, or how those are applied?
Yeah, I mean, I talk about power quite a bit in most of my writing, because I think it's a currency that plays out throughout conflict, and that one of the big mistakes we make in how we handle conflict, or how we construct mediation processes or public dialogues, is we don't understand the power dynamics. So if you're in an organization where you're wanting to do something about sexual harassment, and create a structure that makes it more possible for victims of that to come forward, and you have all sorts of things to protect them. That's great. And why will victims still not come forward? Or why, if they do, will they still likely be out of the organization in 6 months? It's because the power dynamics go pretty deep. And you cannot really address those issues if you don't really look deeply at what's going on in the power dynamics between bosses and employees, between, clergy and their young congregation members when that's happened, between men and women. I mean, I think as conflict professionals, that is the thing we've avoided the most in really building our systems of conflict intervention. And I think it's something leaders are often unaware of. They're unaware of their own power. There's been a lot of experiments about power in organizations that show that those in an empowered position don't realize their power. Those who are less powerful most certainly do.
So you mentioned realism and optimism, and it seems like there are a lot of leaders that have one or the other, but not necessarily both. So how do we impress upon new up-and-coming leaders, and maybe even experienced leaders, how to get both? I know you mentioned earlier you don't like to use the word balance, but
how do you get them both in there?
How do we get them both to be part of the repertoire for a leader to actually do that?
Well, that's a really good question, Mike, because I'm not sure you can get them to do it, but you can talk about it with them. Great. You can have them tell their stories and get them to think a certain way. You can get them to do a reflective practice process. All right, let's look at what happened. I mean, if when I've been in a position of being able to coach somebody, a lot of what's happened is just, what did you say then? Why did you say it? What part of it worked? What was missing? What else might you have done? Does that make sense? Do you believe it? Do you believe it? And unfortunately, higher up leaders get sometimes less open they are to some of that, but I think it's really helpful. I mean, I think the person who's going to win this, here's a prediction, the person who's going to win this election is one that can combine those two things in a most effective way. And if it's somebody who's really good on the optimism, then they're going to really have to work on how do you bring in the realistic questions that people rightfully have. Yeah. Or if you're going to say, look, I just want to get things done. All right, well, what? what is it you can get done that really will make a difference in the world, that's going to really address things that people can really get. So those are, you can work with people on it. But I do think it starts out by asking them to kind of figure it out for themselves to some extent, to point out the challenge and help them learn. We could all think about that for ourselves, because I think this is probably true for all of us. If you've ever had a medical crisis in your family, you've had to figure out a way of dealing with that, for example.
So I have a follow-up to that just because it just popped in my head, and it seems it's probably a little bit more philosophical, but talking about the development of this ability to integrate the two extremes of this paradox, do you feel like that is really possible to do it authentically, or is it just something that's in a person's nature? Because you hear the criticisms like, well, they're just now.
Well, I believe
Not naming any
I'm
names,
optimistic. I believe people can change, but I'm also realistic, knowing that it's not always so easy. Mm-hmm. So, sure. I mean, why even talk about this if it makes no difference? I mean, I think people do change, and we all grow. The more profoundly we're going against type, the harder it is. But it can be done. We do it. I've changed. Some would say for the worse, but I've changed. I think all of you guys have too. But that raises an issue about the kind of work we do. I think the kind of work we do is pretty much built on the belief that people can change and people can make a difference, and that good intentions and goodwill and good practice and good values, I guess, do in fact make a difference, do in fact make us better, do in fact make us better as people, as leaders, as whatever, co-workers, as employees. But not that it's easy. If we're trying to do it too easily, if we have, the world is full of these self-help books that tell you, actually I liked a lot of this in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but it's too much on that idea. You just have to do these 7 things and everything's going to be all right. And I think we have to recognize it's deeper and it takes more work.
I like that. Thank you for that.
I do think it's interesting that for each of us, how have we each changed in some way through our kind of thinking about these things and working about these issues. Not just for me, for example, but I'd like to know what you guys think. One thing that I know I've changed on, it may not sound that way sometimes, but is that I just don't think I have as much certainty about everything as I used to have. That's mostly good. Sometimes it's not so good.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think we all can reflect on how we've changed. And to me, when you pose that question, it's an ongoing process. So change is constant, and just being able to be more aware. And that's one thing that I feel like I have been trying to manifest in myself, is that better awareness of how I interact in the world and what influence that has on the people around me, and trying to be more proactive instead of reactive to situations when my perception of how things should be might not be playing out.
Power of reflection.
Very important. So we've talked about a lot of things, and one question that just comes to mind, you mentioned other self-help books and a lot of other things. There's been, I think, an enormous amount of energy that's been focused about developing leaders who are able to engage conflict in productive ways. In your work, are you seeing whether or not we're making any difference? Are we further along than we were, or it will just always be a challenge that we have to continue to work through?
Yeah, both. We are further along. People certainly understand, many more leaders certainly understand the ideas and the concepts. and are sometimes very good at it. President Obama was trained in mediation at the Harvard Negotiation Project not at Harvard Law School by, I think he was in Frank Sanders' mediation class. I mean, whatever you think about his politically as a president, his rhetoric often reflects that. And at its very best, it reflects it beautifully, like when he went down to Charleston after the bombing of that church, or the shooting of that church. The way in which he was able to reflect, the deep pain and the potential, but the difficulty of becoming a better society around race, which I think moved people across many different political, a broad political spectrum, maybe all the way out there, but a broad political spectrum. That reflected, I think, that. So I think we see it much more in our in awareness many leaders have, but there's also a lot of lip service given to it without it really coming through in practice. I just don't think it's an enduring issue. There's progress that can be made, and your grandchildren will probably talk about their variation in their cultural context with their lingo about the same thing.
Good. Well, talking about enduring, and back to Mike's question about enduring conflict, I think we can now agree that it isn't reasonable to assume that all conflicts can be resolved. But you also mentioned when we were talking about this that some conflicts are more easily resolved than others. There are some that can be resolved. So how would you, or what advice would you give to a leader to deal with that tension there? So identifying the conflicts that can be resolved and working with those and still acknowledging the enduring conflict that's taken place.
Right. So I think the trick in terms of acknowledging the enduring part is how you frame it. I was a divorce mediator earlier in my career. I remember I used to say to people all the time, I think you can figure out this co-parenting stuff, and you can get your way through it. It's hard. On the other hand, I guarantee you that no matter what you agree to now, there'll be times in the future you'll probably face tensions around it, and new issues will come up. And so part of what we're doing right now is coming up with as solid a structure as we can for right now, but one which also allows you to take on new issues as they come up, knowing that it won't always be easy. So it's that kind of framing of it that allows us to focus on the present with a view to the future, and the other reality that is really important. Let me see. Let me talk about a faculty department, because I'm in a university position right now. I'm often asked to help other universities deal with their own internal conflict issues, and very frequently the nature of what faculty say is, well, what's the use? I mean, that person's got tenure, they don't have to change. And so the question, I always have to find a way of saying, well, let's figure out what we can work on, recognizing that, we may be dealing with some tensions and issues and personality issues over time. And so that's the framing part of it. Now we focus on this. Now we have to figure out, all right, what is it that we really need to help people work through right now? Like I recently did a situation that involved who got to teach the pure courses of the highest level of theory that was the highest prestige within that particular discipline, versus who had to go out and teach sort of the courses for the people throughout the university who were not necessarily particularly interested in the highest level of that discipline. Let's pretend that we're talking about writing. It was actually something else, but it could have been, high level of writing in English and creative writing on the one hand, or do you help people learn how to construct an essay that will pass, the survey course in American history for your sophomore year in college or something? So there was that. Now I think that kind of conflict is always present, particularly in university settings, but you probably find your analogy So the trick, of course, is to recognize the underlying issue, the values, to put them out there, and to say, given the fact that there are these differences and these tensions, maybe you think you have, what you have to offer is of a higher intellectual caliber of what this person has to offer. But, that's not going to change. You'll probably think that 20 years from now. What are we going to do now that at least is a fair way that recognizes different contributions and that people feel is fundamentally meets certain standard criteria as it should? So what I've described so far, to a large extent, is about framing the issue and putting the question out there in a way that recognizes it and then focuses people on what they can do. And then I think what a leader needs to figure out is, so what's the right format for this discussion to happen? What's their role? Are they the ones to be part of it? Are they the ones to lead it? Do they need to bring in somebody? A leader, to be effective with conflict, needs to know when they need help, or when they need an outside structure, or when they need or just a different structure, or when they need to bring their whole team together, or just work with a couple of people, or just people one-on-one. And I think leaders who are effective are much more comfortable at bringing in outside, conflict interveners than leaders who are really defensive about that. Not that you always do that, but you have to be strategic about it.
Just want to hear from Bernie. So thinking about this conversation in general, conflict dynamics, leadership, what closing comments would you give to the aspiring leader or even the experienced leader so they can feel more comfortable in their ability to address the conflict dynamics within their...
Well, I don't want to be flippant, but there's part of me that wants to say, to
It's
thine
okay.
own self be true.
Okay.
I mean, I really think, I don't believe I have the answers for leaders. I mean, I believe I know something about some ways of looking at conflict issues that can be useful. But, I mean, I think a lot of it stems from our belief that, and commitment to bringing out what everybody has to offer, even those people are sometimes not so easy to deal with. And so if I were to advise, I guess, leaders of one thing, is to think about your job to some extent is to help everybody be productive. And their job is to help you be productive. And how can you identify the way in which your most pain in the neck employees or team members or whatever, or if you're a leader in a church group, members of your group in the church are potentially productive, and how can you help them find a way to find that way of contributing, given the fact that there may be a lot of obstacles in the way to do it. And so that starts out by saying, this is what I believe. If you believe you know better than anybody else, and you know what needs to happen, and you're just going to use some of these techniques to kind of get people on board with doing what you want them to do, well, that will come out in the end. But leaders who seem to run very successful organizations by telling everybody what to do. Maybe their employees aren't always so happy, but doesn't mean the organization's not.
Thank you.
Dr. Mayer, on behalf of the Journal, thank you very much for providing us with so much insight and intriguing dialogue. And on behalf of all of us, thank you for your time and giving us a lot to reflect on as we spend time on this issue, thinking about how to prepare leaders to transform complex environments.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I enjoyed talking to you guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Bernie.